Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss the reasons why businesses can't plan for Brexit. But first, if you find yourself enjoying the video, then please consider clicking the like button and subscribing to the channel. It helps a lot. So when it comes to businesses planning for Brexit, there are a number of issues, some obvious, some not so obvious. The supply chain is one obvious consideration. If you are a business who sources any raw materials from the EU or you sell products to the EU, then there are obvious difficulties with Brexit. Will you have to cope with tariffs, quotas, making either your raw materials or products more expensive or more difficult to come by? Will you be able to arrange transport easily? Most businesses can't really afford to stockpile, so they need orders completing within a day or two. You can't afford to have your products or raw materials stuck at border control for 5 days. If there is a serious prospect of this, then you have to change your business. As a result of this, various EU businesses that deal with UK businesses have been changing suppliers. Yes, British businesses have been trying to do the same, but it always comes down to this. The EU collectively is much greater than the UK alone, and so the net loss is to British business. Now, on the issue of car manufacturing, an example that keeps cropping up, EU-based car manufacturers have already been advising their businesses to source their parts from the EU and not the UK to prevent issues if and when we leave. Now, the second issue is investment. So for businesses to grow, they need to invest, of course. And a number of British-based businesses were holding off that investment to see what would happen over Brexit. But as time passed, those businesses couldn't really put off those decisions anymore, and they had to make their decisions based on long-term reality, and that was that the UK may still be in the EU in the next 5 years, may have left with a deal in the next 5 years, or it may have left without a deal. In that situation, it's too risky to invest in the UK if there was an option to do so elsewhere. Now, for many businesses, they had the option and they did invest elsewhere. That means that even if we decide to stay in the end, that investment is permanently lost to us. And the uncertainty is what puts off investors. The difference between the three possible conclusions to Brexit is huge and has a massive impact on strategic planning. But it's not just about the outcomes, it's also when certain things will happen. The uncertainty over both the outcome and the timing is a toxic mix that basically puts a big old sign on the coast of Britain saying there'd be dragons here, keep away. Now, I was watching an Institute for Government event where an expert panel went over some of the major considerations. One of them mentioned that a key question businesses have in the event of a no deal is how long would the WTO terms last? So a no deal Brexit is of course disastrous for most businesses in some way or other, but there is a suggestion when the full realisation of what WTO terms actually mean actually dawns on people that we will be very hastily going back to the EU to agree to terms pretty quickly. If we end up in the already agreed transition period within a few months of leaving, then there are businesses who could ride out the damage. But what if we're stubborn? What if we try to soldier on with purely WTO terms, which no other country in the world is stupid enough to do, until we get a less brain-addled government? And what if that doesn't happen for a year or more? In that situation, some of those businesses will not cope as well, and if they have the option of relocating, well, maybe they'd be better doing that. So even if we leave with no deal, there is still no certainty. Frankly, even leaving with the withdrawal agreement is uncertain because it says nothing about the intended final relationship with the EU. It was a plan only for the next year, not the next 5 that many businesses need to plan for. Similarly, with the compensation that both Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt have promised to shield British businesses from the impact of a no-deal Brexit, well, these contingency plans only cover them for a year, after which there is no commitment from the government at all. And with the Chancellor saying that there is no money for those plans in the event of no deal, businesses will not even be sure if those promises can be delivered upon, even for the 12 months described. In fact, because the only certainty there can be is with another public vote and Remain winning, businesses are stuck without enough information for any mid to long-term planning. Any form of Brexit is uncertain for them because the government, whether you're talking about Theresa May's or either of the candidates that are going to form the next one, have not laid out their plan for settling arrangements with the EU. Now, although a deal would be better, there is no certainty there either. A no deal gives certainty that we will be outside of the EU, but it's not how we will trade with the EU. And businesses can't be deluded enough to think that it'll all sort itself out. Business is competitive, and it only works out if you work it out. And there simply isn't enough information to do that. Now, given that the flow of goods is going to be so crucial in this matter, The panel also discussed legal and illegal actions. So in the event of the UK leaving without a deal, you instantly create a situation whereby you have a free trade area in the form of the EU next to a non-free trade area in the form of the UK. That means borders and checks must be observed. This, of course, would be disastrous for all parties. It's a disaster for the flow of goods from an economic perspective, and for UK citizens, it has a direct impact on getting such vital commodities as food and medicine into the country. There wouldn't simply be delays in the case of food. Food will spoil. You just can't leave it on a hard shoulder for several days. But there's also a political disaster waiting in the forms of areas around the border within Ireland. Now, what both sides would like to do is to simply ignore the rules and allow movement to occur as it does now. This would be illegal under WTO rules, but the consequences aren't that severe in the short term. From a legal point of view, other countries would, of course, complain to the WTO and a legal process would begin. 2 or 3 years later, that process would conclude and, of course, we'd be found guilty and told to sort ourselves out. But there's no financial penalty like a massive fine. We'd just be told that at that point we have to now behave ourselves. So we could say that we can just ignore all border restrictions for a couple of years to sort ourselves out with a more permanent solution. And so, there may be no problems at the borders at all if we decide to just go down the illegal route. But that's just from a legal perspective. The countries that would begin that legal process would still be pissed off with both the UK and EU, and both may lose the goodwill of these countries in current trade negotiations. For example, both the US and China would definitely be unhappy, and the EU is at least wanting to foster a good trading arrangement with both. So it may be that the EU at least doesn't want to break those rules for fearing the impact it might have on trade with China and the USA, but that's not known. We can only speculate, as the EU have not definitively said what they would do in the event of a no deal, only that international rules dictates that they have to observe a hard border. Now, on the issue of the mythological technological solution, the panel confirmed what we all know. There is no technological solution that would currently solve the problem. And if there were, well, it's not in place, so it still wouldn't. So there needs to be regulatory systems to cope at the borders. And even if the EU were willing to antagonise other countries and break the law for a couple of years, as the UK are certainly planning to do, then you still need a solution to be found at some point. And that solution needs the UK to drop a load of its red lines. There is only one solution to a situation like this, and that is some form of customs union, of course. And the panel did finally say that what's really important is that the end-to-end suppliers understand any new processes for moving between the UK and the EU. And they believed that would take a lot longer to achieve than putting in the infrastructure, putting in those systems. As of this moment in time, nobody at all is familiar with how you are going to get goods across the border on November the 1st, that's when we've left, as compared to October the 31st, which is Boris Johnson's intended last day in the EU. So all in all, it is quite impossible for any business that has any dealings outside of the UK to be able to cope. And don't fall for this guff about it only applying to a small percentage of UK companies. It applies to almost all of them. In fact, of a poll of British businesses, 96% said they were unprepared for Brexit. Even businesses that don't directly buy from or sell to the EU are part of a large, complex supply chain. You might, for example, own a roadside cafe and buy your sausages locally. You may think that such a business is not impacted by this. But if the farmer you buy from goes under due to lack of subsidy and the lorries stop driving past because of border chaos, then you don't own a cafe anymore. The supply chain is long and complicated, and there is hardly a business in the country that wouldn't be affected in some way. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please click the Patreon link to find out more. And until next time, I'll see you later.